Tracey Travis. Tracey is a 1986 alum, so it's good that she's here because because 1986 got a lot of high marks from Erin's in her introduction. Right. Tracey is an incredibly successful financial executive in different companies. I met her when she was CFO at Estée Lauder. She's on our board for many years, and she's now the chair of our board. And as a result, she and I have partnered quite closely for quite some time now, and it's wonderful to work with her. After stepped down as CFO, she has been serving on several boards, and we'll talk a little bit about that, from Accenture to Brusnik to Hyatt, and until recently at Meta. So, top of mind on the types of things that are crucial to our school. And like me, Tracey started as an engineer that then moved into business. I never moved into business, but in some sense, I moved eventually later in life. She's had an incredible career, and she has been incredibly involved at the school. And before we jump in to talk a little bit about what you see in business and AI and talk a little bit about the school, I want to give you the floor. I'd love you to share some comments about your journey from engineer to business to sort of head of finance in sort of incredible organizations and the like.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here at Reunion and see so many of you. And thank you for that warm introduction, Costis. I am a recovered engineer, although I don't know if you ever recover from engineering, but because engineering certainly has influenced how I've navigated my career path, even though most of it has been in finance and other roles. But I started my career as a reliability engineer in the automotive industry. And many people don't know what a reliability engineer does, but I worked on new products for one of the component divisions at General Motors, designed process charts and process standards for manufacturing for one of the component divisions at General Motors. Used a lot of statistical process control, really designed those processes. And loved engineering and thought that I wanted to be a general manager of a manufacturing operation when I navigated throughout my career. And what really changed that was Columbia. I came to Columbia to study operations management. I believe Martin Starr at the time was head of the operations management program. Took my first finance class, fell in love with finance, and did a double concentration in finance and operations management. Went back to General Motors in finance roles, but working with a lot of the engineers on the international side of the business. So I had the opportunity to work with many of the international operations at General Motors in Asia Pacific and South America, on new product programs and work with the engineers to adapt some of those processes to those markets and really enjoyed doing that. I left General Motors and went to work for Pepsi, and I was at Pepsi for 10 years, 6 years in finance and strategy roles, and 4 years actually running one of their markets. And one of the things that I did, and you'll hear some common themes in terms of the experiences that I've had, but at Pepsi, one of the roles I had in strategy was when Pepsi, and it was mostly on the beverage side that I worked, they decided that instead of just being a soft drink company, they wanted to be a beverage company. And we called it share of stomach. They wanted to capture more share of stomach. And so, which was great from a research standpoint. So my role in working with the marketing organization was to determine which beverage categories did they have the right to enter into and how they should enter into them. Joint venture, acquisition, innovation. Think juice, tea, isotonics, coffee, water. All categories which they eventually moved into and were faster growth categories than their core soft drink business. So that was tremendous experience. And again, working on new products, working on business plans, working with the marketing organization. And then 4 years actually running a market in Michigan, which, shifting from strategy to actually day-to-day operations, running a plant, running a distribution center, and leading a sales force. And so I had wonderful experience, 10 years at PepsiCo. I left and went to help a company do an IPO. And then, I would say started the second chapter of my career, which was in retail, fashion, and beauty. And, many people say, how did you get from automotive to retail, fashion, and beauty? It was not planned, but there were opportunities there, and certainly to leverage some of the experience that I had coming from a beverage consumer products background into those industries. So I became the CFO of what was Intimate Brands at the time, which was Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works. Then I went on to be the CFO at Ralph Lauren, and then ended my career as CFO of Estée Lauder Company. And the commonality was growth. And so whether it was, retail distribution, expansion into new markets, expansion into online and digital, and M&A activity as well in terms of diversification of product portfolios. Those were all things that, that I had the opportunity to work on. So, I have been very fortunate through my career and have had the opportunity to work with some amazing people and amazing teams. But that pivot in terms of my thought process on career really came from Columbia. So I owe a lot of credit to Columbia for the choices that I made and the success that I had.
It continues to be, just to inject a comment, that about 75% of the students really do a significant career change when they come to study here at the business school. For 50% of them, it's a sort of a massive switch from a non-business career to a business career, right? And then there are other people that were doing consulting, they want to switch to banking, or they were doing banking, they want to switch into something else. So in some sense, this continues to be the main reason why people come to business school. Fantastic. You have now entered yet another chapter where you serve on 3 boards, and before that you were at Meta. So you served in one board, Meta, that was on the frontier of AI. You serve on the Accenture board, which actually does enormous amount of work of implementing, consulting, telling people how to deploy AI and helping in the deployment of AI. Brunswick, which has to do with leadership, advertising, PR, communications, and the like, which I'm sure that's, again, a topic. It's being both disrupted and it's crucial to their clients. And then Hyatt, which is obviously, we all know Hyatt, and there you're thinking, how are you going to change who you are and change your products and services using AI? So, you see it from every angle, from the sort of foundational angle, I want to build the best AI on the planet, to how am I going to use it to change how I serve my customers? What do you see on the ground, and where do you see it being deployed successfully at this point in time?
Yeah, no, I certainly have seen a full spectrum. So, starting with Meta, obviously a tech company, certainly the furthest along as it relates to the deployment of AI, both internally as it relates to their processes. But, AI has, Meta has always had very sophisticated algorithms that run their ad business and their social media business. And I was on that board for 6 years. And for 6 years, we talked about diversification. The ads business is incredibly strong. It's growing, it's been growing double digit. AI has actually helped that. But, looking for additional revenue streams for growth. They've moved into devices. And to your point, Costis are now focused on really developing a leading edge LLM model. LLM and frontier models as well. And, some of that to support their existing business, but also, to create a new revenue stream in terms of subscription models. Accenture, in addition to deploying, and all of my boards are deploying AI in some fashion, as well as helping others, from a business client standpoint. So, it's been a big growth business from a consulting standpoint for Accenture. In Hyatt, they're focused on improving and increasing the client experience with, leveraging AI for not only their guests, but also their franchise managers and their employees. So really taking some of the friction out of some of their processes. And then Brunswick is a communications firm, and they help, whether, a communication as it relates to AI, they're involved in AI, helping companies in terms of AI regulation and investor relations. Most of my experience with AI has been in board governance. I mean, when I was CFO at Estée Lauder, we did some pilots, but not, anything at scale, which many companies are not using AI at scale right now. But from a board standpoint, making sure that as the companies are focusing on AI, board governance, we understand what the strategy is, their AI strategy, that it is enabling their strategy and maybe accelerating their strategy. There is an understanding of risks associated with the implementation of AI, whether it's, increased cyber risks, internal controls. Obviously, as CFO, I'm always on the audit committee or chairing the audit committee. So that's a big focus of ours as well. What the impact is on the workforce. From a competitive standpoint, what are other competitors in their industry doing, and how does the company stack up? So those are really the focus areas from a board governance standpoint. And again, what is the impact on the workforce and how they're managing and handling that? So it has been fantastic to have that broad of an overview from a board perspective of AI and how it's being developed, thought, and deployed throughout various industries.
So I feel I'm in my school. I feel I'm the move fast and break things guy in AI, and my beloved CFO and COO keeps like trying to box me in, and part of it is sort of organizationally navigating change. Mm-hmm. It's not just about controls, and it's not just about risk. It's really the hardest thing, which I'm sure in your Accenture, in your Hyatt experience, you must be seeing, is like the ability of large organizations to digest change. Mm-hmm. Now, you have led through that in your prior experience, mm-hmm. right? And now you're seeing it on your board experience. What do you see on the ground, and what are the lessons from your own past experience of how we're going to navigate that period? Because in some sense, we're going to spend the next 10, 20 years implementing AI, and sort of changing organizations, changing products, changing services. What do you think works? What do you think is important?
Yeah, one of the things that, as I've navigated through in my career different industries, I've always been brought in as a change agent. And, and I've always said, if you want someone to manage status quo, don't get me. And so, and having done it through different industries, I kind of have a bit of a playbook in terms of how to think about it, really understanding the company strategy. Understanding the company culture, and what is the saying? Culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch. Those two go hand in hand in terms of understanding, how quickly and how to go about managing change, and then the capabilities of the organization and what needs to change. And so. I have navigated that throughout my career. As it relates to AI, the pace of change is just phenomenal. And so when you think about today, what LLMs and frontier models can do, 2 to 3 years from now, they'll be able to do even more. And so it really is, quite a significant exercise for organizations to bring their workforce up to speed. You've probably seen in the press, most companies are mandating that their employees use AI, whether it is using Copilot for emails and presentations to some companies actually, trying to get their people to do coding and agents. There's a big talent reskilling process that's happening in organizations, and obviously a talent, downsizing that's happening in organizations as well. So I'm a big proponent of bringing people along, being very upfront and communicating with people, trying to reskill when you can, and the company taking that responsibility on themselves. But it is a massive amount of change that will continue to happen. And organizations are struggling with how fast the technology is changing relative to what their employee base can adopt. Companies like Accenture, are very good at working with companies on this. I mean, when you think about outside of tech and maybe information or knowledge-based companies, manufacturing companies, which you touched on before, product-oriented companies, have a lot of legacy processes that fundamentally need to change in order to really be able to implement AI at scale. And that's something that, companies are increasingly learning. Again, from a board standpoint, we want to understand at some point what ROI do we expect to get out of the implementation of AI in addition to implementing it responsibly. But right now, just getting the organization comfortable with using AI and the implications associated with it, and really focused on continuous improvement is a big area of focus from a change management standpoint.
So I'll tell you, before we switch to something else, even in this school, I mean, we're in the business of educating people, and I mentioned 30% going to consulting, 30% going to financial services, 15% going to tech. I didn't mention that. So about 75% of our students, when they graduate, go into positions where when they show up for their interviews, they need to be power users of these technologies, right? Not I'm interacting with a chatbot, but I'm what they call a builder, right? I can actually do stuff and build apps, build dashboards, do analysis and the like. And what's, of course, interesting is that our faculty are not there. Okay? So we're actually doing boot camps. We're training the faculty, we're training the staff, we're training against the faculty, and you're training against the staff. So in some sense, we're actually building curricula to bring our community, to reskill our own community. Now, we're fortunate to know how to do that because we do have the people that are actually educating the students. So, we put the same people in front of the faculty and the staff. But it is a massive push, and it's making people nervous. And it's interesting to sort of navigate that journey. As a plug, if anybody is interested in reskilling the workforce, call us. We know how to do that well, and we're investing in that.
I think one of the things that helps that, to your point, Costis, is really sharing some of the wins. You can't communicate, when you're leading change, you can't communicate enough in terms of some of the positive wins, rewarding employees for actually being able to create tools that really help the organization. So it's quite a lot to counteract some of the negative anxiety that's out there right now as it relates to AI, and some of it certainly is understandable. But there is no question that companies, institutions need to adopt it. They need to adopt it, responsibly and safely. But the train has left the station, and so
there was this talking point that Uber blew through their token budget for the year by April. So it's it's very interesting. We're having the same experience here in a smaller scale, but we go into classes where we put our students and we give them access to tools, and then before you know it, you realize you're spending thousands of dollars per person because they're just like building stuff, and we need to sort of be cognizant of that. When you look back, 5, 10, 15 years from now, what would you wish to have known, or as you were navigating that period? And what would you say to our audience about what should they be paying attention right now, given what you see?
Yeah. Well, and I think 10 years ago, 2016, it was, after the financial crisis and before the pandemic. And there was still a lot of change going on. And so, have always been focused on trying to make sure that the organization had enough agility to manage change. I can recall saying at the start of every fiscal year to my board, we've navigated successfully through an unprecedented level of change. And then that, only to experience even more change that next year. And so, I think, if I think back to, and have gone through organization redesigns and redevelopment, but, I don't know that I could have imagined the level of, change and transformation that is being driven by AI. So that's something that, if I think about it, would make sure that companies were even more agile and more flexible, that training programs were sufficient in organizations to continue to reskill. In one of my roles, I stood up a transformation office. We had just gone through a major transformation, and I recognized that by the time we finished that transformation, another, change was coming. So needing to make sure that the organization was capable of handling, more change, but this change is at a whole different exponential level. And so I think that's something that I think, certainly, I would have loved to have known 10 years ago. I'm sure many others would as well.
So I have one last question, and then we'll open it up a little bit. But when I was doing my commencement speech, a buddy of mine was there. He was the speaker for the MS PhD ceremony. And it's like, you reuse the comments from your last year's past commencement speeches? I look at him, I said, Deepak, no. First year I was here, COVID. Second year, COVID. Third year, it was right when we had moved here, so obviously we're talking about that. Fourth year, it looks like maybe we're getting a stride. Then October 7th, then Trump, now, okay? So I'm like, I haven't hit steady state. And I don't think I'm gonna hit it anytime soon.
Yeah, this may be steady state, which is a scary thing, right? Yeah. This is the new norm.
So we have incredible alums in front of us that are engaged with the school. And you, of course, are one of the champions of the school, and you chair our board, and you've been so involved. But this is actually the result of a long journey. So you want to tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, no, it has been a journey. So when I graduated in 1986 and went back to the automotive industry, I moved out of the area, and so I kind of lost touch with the school for about 20 years. When I came to Ralph Lauren and moved back in the area, I got re-involved with the school, and starting with the Hermes leadership group. I always want to call it Hermes because I come from fashion, but the Hermes Association, and then the program for financial leadership. I got involved in that. I actually guest lectured in one of the retail and consumer classes here for a number of years as well, and really enjoyed the engagement with the students that were just so incredibly knowledgeable and global, and so it was really helpful, being in a global organization in a global role, just to hear the student perspective. So I did that for a number of years. Then I joined the board under Dean Glenn and Hubbard, and was on the board for a number of years. Then became chair of the Nom and Gov committee and co-chair of the board, and now chair of the board. During that time, I've met with a number of students. I've participated in, a lot of the various student events around the school. I've endowed scholarships. It's been incredible. I'm only sorry that, I lost the first 20 years, and it's such an incredible school. It's been so wonderful to be re-engaged and to see the work that you're driving, Costis, throughout the school, and it's just been wonderful. So, for those of you who are not engaged, as Costis started, I would really encourage you to get engaged. The students are fantastic. You'll learn a lot and contribute a lot, and they really, really do have a hunger to hear from alumni and get perspective on what career journeys can look like and what that experience and how Columbia has contributed to your experience. So,
All right, so let's open it up for a few questions. All right, we have a few running mics. We'll start there, and then we'll come somewhere here. I saw a hand right here, over there.
So it sounds like the demand for AI is huge across all of the companies that you have worked at and the companies that you've been mentioning, Dean. And I know that, Tracey, you mentioned the responsible aspect of this, but it's really worrying to me because you think about these data centers and the impact on the environment. I presume it's not just an effect on the employees, but effect on the environment. So I guess I'm just throwing this out there. What can Columbia do? What can we all do? What do you expect to be the progress there?
yeah, there is a lot of anxiety now, to your point, as it relates to data centers and power. And the impact on communities, and that is something that is becoming an increasingly concerning PR issue for the AI community. And I know that a lot of the frontier model companies are working with some of the local organizations and local communities in terms of what they can do. And there's regulation, and there's a lot of discussion from a political standpoint in terms of how the communities can be protected as these data centers are being built. It's analogous, but it's not the same. If you think about the growth coming from retail of e-commerce and the number of warehouses that were being built to support e-commerce in communities, and there was some concern at the time, that Amazon was exploding and warehouses were going everywhere. There's some analogy to that, but the infrastructure investment has to happen in order to support the training of the models and and the inference, basically the use of the models. AI adoption right now is, you hear about it all the time. It's still relatively low. And you think about AI adoption from a consumer standpoint, and then AI adoption from a business standpoint, and where that's going to be headed over the next few years. And you have to be able to, power it. So it's a concern right now. I know there's a lot going on as it relates to, again, working with communities, working with the federal government, along with the companies on how to manage it, and not just the frontier model companies, but obviously the companies building the data centers, the companies financing the data centers, and there'll be more to come there for sure to make sure that there aren't adverse impacts on communities. I've got two daughters. One of them lives in Ashburn, Virginia. It's a beautiful community, but there are certain roads that you drive down in Ashburn, Virginia, because Northern Virginia is one of the core spots for data centers, and it's one data center after another. And so it is a bit interesting when you see that, but I think there's certainly more to come to make sure that communities are not adversely impacted by the building of this infrastructure that's needed to support the penetration of AI going forward.
jump in and make 3 comments. You probably know, but I want to repeat that sort of thinking about the energy transition and climate is a huge priority for the school. And our students are genuinely curious about it, and they want to be educated, and we have the most robust curriculum in that among all of our peers. The second thing is power is the bottleneck right now on AI, and that's why when companies talk about building out AI, compute, and inference capacity, they actually don't talk about GPUs anymore. They talk about gigawatts of power, right? They measure the size of the power that they will consume, because it turns out they will have to build that power generation because we don't have slack power in this country. And this is, in fact, one area that US-China relationship is sort of building faster than we are, and that puts us at a disadvantage. The third, because I'm a professor, I'll give you a little factoid to remember. In the last 30 years, chips, our semiconductor industry has become so much more efficient that, right now, per constant dollar, if you spend $1 today, you do 1 billion times more calculations than you were doing 30 years ago. Adjusted, the dollar is adjusted for inflation. That's just how much more efficient is our compute. It turns out because we're making things smaller, we're also more power efficient. And in fact, we are 10 million times more power efficient per calculation, okay? And of course, the astute audience has realized there is a difference between 10 million and 1 billion, and that's a factor of 100, which means that every dollar we spend today to do compute, we're consuming 100 times more electricity than 30 years ago, okay? We're very efficient, 10 million times more efficient, but we're still burning 100 times. So our electricity consumption in compute is growing by leaps and bounds, and this energy issue is something that we need to be addressing, okay? There's a lot of work happening actually at Columbia in that topic alone, okay? One more question. All right. Anywhere, pick. Whoever has the mic can pick, okay? But pick fast, all right?
Actually, I have a question for the Dean, because, we always talk about AI, how it affects our life and everything. But, on Monday, I'm starting to teach a class in Milan, and I've been struggling on how AI affects teaching. Even last year, I was talking to one of the professors at Columbia, a friend, and she was like, I have a lot of students are using AI to do the homework, so I need to use a software to check if the homework has been made with AI. We had to expel 2 students actually. So how are you managing this thing of either giving tools, but on the other hand, making sure that the tool is not used in the wrong way?
So, first of all, here at the business school, we not only assume, but we encourage people to use AI, because to be honest, when you go to get a job, you will be tested in your interview process whether you're like enormously proficient in that. So that requires a huge change. I mentioned that, our house is on fire. It's because, yes, this is, a lot of things are changing. Our old methods of assessment. Last year we built a process where we sort of fed all homeworks and all exams through the AIs to see how would they have done. And, they would have done pretty well. And right now, of course, they would ace everything and, and find the typos on the exams and do, all sorts of crazy things. So we need to adopt and we need to change. And let me give you an idea. I think that when you come to class, oftentimes you would come to class, we would assign a case study, you would prepare the case study, you would come to class, and I would say, what was the case about? And you would say, oh, the case about was PepsiCo and their decision to open a plant outside of Atlanta. And I would say, okay, somebody else, let's talk about X, Y, and Z. Well, the way we need to actually carry the conversation right now is that you and I will continue the conversation about that case for about 10 minutes. And it turns out if I ask you 7 questions and we sort of ping pong, you better know what's going on. And I don't actually care if you use AI to really learn everything about the PepsiCo case. I just want you to know it. And if I speak to you for 10 minutes, I can speak to you for 3 minutes and I will know whether you know it. But in 10 minutes, we will have a very in-depth discussion. And then I will switch to Michel and I will have a discussion with him. And then, so in some sense, we need to actually assess people in the classroom, right? And we need to be a lot more deliberate in doing that. And in fact, if we do it well, we make classroom experience much more engaging. And if you prepare using AI, you're more prepared to have a very meaningful discussion in the classroom. So it actually requires change from the faculty side, but it's not a losing proposition, it's actually a gaining proposition. So that's where we're pushing right now. All right? Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tracey.
Absolutely. Thank you.